Well, welcome to another episode of Keys to Revival. I'm Rob Coburn, and I am so excited about this episode of Keys to Revival. Today, you're going to enter into and you're going to observe one of the best conversations I've ever heard about revival and about awakening and about the history of two of what I would consider my best friends. This interview was actually recorded at a conference that we did at our church here, the Summit in Dover, Ohio. And this conversation is between Pastor Penn Clark and Bishop Tommy Reid. Pastor Penn is a mentor from Middle New York, the Finger Lakes of New York, and Bishop Tommy Reid is one of my spiritual fathers who is from the Tabernacle in Orchard Park, New York. Now, the great thing is they really connected this weekend, but this conversation was actually when they first met. So discover the amazing things that came out in this conversation in this Keys to Revival episode.
Well, I'm just grateful for this opportunity to sit down with Pastor Tommy Reid. We're talking about church revival history. I've read about it. He's experienced it. He's lived it.
Well, I kind of have experienced it all over the world, really.
At 90 years old, you've lived in a pivotal time in church history.
I have.
Having experienced and met some of the real key players from the previous generation, and then seeing all that's happened through the charismatic renewal.
Maybe 3 or 4 generations.
Yeah, actually.
The first major person in history that I probably met, along with, the average leader, would have been Jack Coe, became a very close friends of my family's.
Wow.
And when my mother died, Jack Coe talked my father through the entire death process.
And encouraged him and supported him and comforted
through the
him.
whole thing.
Wow, Jack Coe. For those who don't know, he had one of the largest healing ministries.
He was the man that had the most miracles anybody have ever seen.
Bold faith, like amazing faith, gift of faith.
Yeah, in the Metropolitan Opera House in Philadelphia, a man came that literally facing the ground. His back was so bent. And he said, God's going to heal you. Put his foot in the man's back and just took him and just jerked him and sat him up straight. Then literally kicked him and said, run. And he went running through the Metropolitan Opera House.
Totally set free.
Yeah, he had bold faith, just unbelievable faith. The first night I saw him, I was a young, probably 20-year-old, maybe 19-year-old Bible student, and thinking Pentecostalism ought to get themselves straightened out and become and behave like other churches, or we're going to lose the world. And so I went to Jack Coe's meeting. Actually, I didn't want to go until I was on my way up to see J. Roswell Flower, the General Secretary of the Assemblies of God. Jack Coe was coming down the stairs from seeing Brother Flower. We met halfway up the stairs. He backed me up against the wall. I'm just a 19-year-old, very cocky. And he said to me, have you come to hear me preach? And I said, no, Brother Coe, and I wasn't intending to. And I thought, why did I say that? I guess I want to be a young rebel. And that doesn't even sound like me because I'm not very rebellious. And he backed me up against the wall, put his fingers in my chest, and said, I am not letting you go till you say you're coming to hear me preach.
Wow.
And I went the first night to see that man preach. And it was the life-changing experience of my life. He lined up 63 women with goiters. In those days, we didn't have the medication we have today.
Goiter is a big
goiters were a great big thing.
Ball.
Yeah, a great big ball. And I watched him go down that line. All he said was the name of Jesus, and he hit those women enough to almost knock them over, and I saw 62 of those goiters instantly disappear.
Amazing.
And I sat there. I mean, I couldn't get hold of myself. It changed my life.
Wow.
To see a visible miracle in front of my eyes.
He was a big, bold, imposing man. Was he a physically
Yeah,
big
he
man?
was physically very large, probably weighed maybe 300 pounds, at least 270 or 280.
Wow.
I would say 300. And probably, if I remember right, maybe 6'2", tall, and, large, not fat, but large.
Yeah.
And he was one of the most kindest, most wonderful gentlemen
Really?
I've ever met in my
Wow,
life.
how good to hear that.
And when my mother was dying with cancer, every night he would call the house. And he would tell, how's it going tonight? And he'd talk to my dad. When my dad get through, you want Jack Coe to heal you. When you see the miracles, you believe he's going to heal you. And that didn't happen, but he put faith in my father in the middle of that.
Is not something. Wow. A contemporary of his would have been A.A. Allen.
A. Allen.
What do you know about him personally? Is there have any?
Let me tell you, the last time I saw A. Allen, we had bought every evangelist to drive Cadillacs, and we were an evangelist, and we couldn't afford a new one, but we got a 3-year-old Cadillac convertible, and we went down to see A. Allen, and A. Allen's coming across, and he knew us because we were members of the Voice of Healing, and we were one of the Voice of Healing evangelists, and so A. Allen comes out. He lays his hand, I remember, on the side of that Cadillac. My dad's driving, and I'm sitting beside him. And he said, so you joined the club. You got a Cadillac.
The Cadillac Club for Evangelists.
It was a Cadillac Club for evangelists in those days.
Wow.
Yeah.
A.A.
Didn't
Allen?
have to be new, but
How about Oral Roberts in those early days? Any experience?
I didn't know Oral in those. Now, of course, in his latter life, I was head of the financial committee, so I was very close to him. He was one of the most gentlest, finest men I've ever met in my life. I'll tell you a story about him. If you like personal stories, I think I was in the back seat. I had a driver for the car. Oral was in the front seat. Wanda and I were in the back. And we got out and we're ready to leave to go to the airport to get his airplane. And as we were driving out, he leaned back and he said, Wanda, give me a hug, will you? I need a hug. She was in the back seat, and so she grabbed over and grabbed his neck. He said, I needed that.
Wow, wow.
That was a very sweet-natured man.
I heard Jack Hayford say that he come out of a Pentecostal background, but one of the great things that he saw with Oral Roberts is his meetings had tremendous order.
Yes.
Were you in his meetings?
Yes, I think I was only in once or twice. I knew him later in life, but in those days I was with him once or twice because we were all members of the Voice of Healing. But there was a lot of Voice of Healing evangelists. And so I didn't know him well in those days, but at the end of his life, he was a very close friend, and I was head of the financial committee.
Tell someone who wouldn't know, a young person who wouldn't know what the Voice of Healing was. What was that? The
Voice of Healing was an evangelist, actually a businessman by the name of Jack Moore. He was in the city of Shreveport, Louisiana. He was a major contractor, built many, many of the subdivisions, and said to Gordon Lindsay, would you help me? Why don't we just start some kind of a magazine, and we'll invite Brother Branham and Oral Roberts, and we'll put all these evangelists together. So they did. So it started with William Branham, and Oral was part of it, and A. Allen was part of it. But it didn't work because, well, the magazine went on, but the whole thing, everybody started their own magazine. So now you were a competitor with yourself. So it didn't work.
And were some of the evangelists competing with other evangelists for recognition or for?
Well, I don't know. It was competition.
Was there camaraderie?
But then you think you got the amount of space in the magazine by the number of subscriptions you sold. So if you sold 500 subscriptions, you got a full page. I know I was one of those evangelists. And, when a guy got 1,500 or 2,000 subscriptions, he might as well start his own magazine.
Yeah.
So it just wasn't a working business model.
Yeah. You mentioned William Branham. Tell me what you know about William Branham.
I didn't know William Branham well. I was in his meetings. You know what? I'm going to say something very strange. The only thing I know about William Branham is you couldn't be around him without crying. When you were in his presence, tears had burst forth in your eyes. And I said to my dad one day, I don't even want to go and see him because I can't I lose control of myself. As soon as I feel him, I feel God. And then I've heard several other people tell me the same thing, that you couldn't be around the man without tearing up.
I've heard the same thing about Paul Kane, that they couldn't sit near the door of a restaurant because people coming into the restaurant would start crying.
Yeah.
And he said it was because Jesus called me to be his friend, and that people could sense that.
William Branham was a wonderful man. When we think historically, you think about the fact that he said some strange things doctrinally. He was a very simple man, and I think he enjoyed going to Scripture and try to interpret it. And sometimes he didn't come up with proper definitions, I think.
Was he trying to be unique? Trying to be different from everyone else?
I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But if you read some of his stuff, he got into very deep theological, and sometimes it didn't make sense, in my estimation.
Do you remember your impression of being in one of his meetings, what you saw, what you felt?
You know what? I'm going to give you a strange answer. I don't remember which. I just remember some of the things, and I remember that I heard them or saw them. He was in, I don't think I actually saw this, but I was close to the people that did see it. They were in, I think, the St. Nicholas Arena in New York, and he went to the platform, and there were, I think it was 12 wheelchairs in the front row, and he stood up and he said, "Walk in the name of Jesus," and as he went down the line, every single one of them got up and walked.
Wow. Amazing.
He was a man of great faith.
Wow. Any idea why we're not seeing that same level today?
Oh, I think we're going to see it. If somebody plays this tape 2 years from now, they'll wonder why you said that. Because I think we're about to see it again, but in a greater dimension.
How encouraging.
Yeah.
Wow.
I see that as clearly as I see you right now.
It just seemed like there was a restoration or a recapturing of things that had been lost from the early church.
Well, I think that's the way, as I remember the healing move, everybody I know talked about as restoration. We're restoring the church to the first century. And I think to a certain extent it did that. Those were wonderful days. I don't know how historians look at them, but those healing revivals and being close to it, because I was a young man, but I was a voice of healing evangelist. Now, I only have a couple of pages because you had to sell 500 subscriptions to get a full page. But
You're a better evangelist than you were a salesman?
Well, I was young. We were small in our meetings, and we had A. Allen and we had Jack Coe and all of those other evangelists as part of the magazine at first. And, they were, Jack Coe would have 10,000 people in his tent, and we'd have 200 in the Assembly of God Church,
Wow.
We're doing the same thing, but hadn't reached the top yet.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Tell us about your ministry. How'd you start, and where did that all come from?
I think it all started when I was 8 years of age, and probably about 200 miles from where we're sitting right now, in East Aurora, New York. I'm sitting at the altar at the Assembly of God Church, and I began to see things, and I saw myself preaching to people, and I saw people getting out of wheelchairs and walking, and I knew that was me. I think that's where it started.
So there's some destiny, some predestination, or just a glimpse of the future?
My story is that I was a very heavy stutterer and also extremely shy. I could hardly get up to you because I was afraid to open my mouth. And I'll never forget, my mother and dad had all the executives of the Assemblies of God at our home. And outside the door, I heard my mother walk by my bedroom. I'm trying to go to sleep. I'm just a boy, becoming a young man, but very young. And I'm trying to get to sleep. And my mother is walking by the door, and the wife of one of the general superintendents assistant general superintendent of the Assemblies of God, is walking by, and I knew it, and I knew that was Charlotte and my mother. And Charlotte says to my mother, "What's Tommy going to do with his life?" Oh, my mother said, "He's going to be a preacher." And this woman, whom I greatly respected, her husband is, very big in the Assemblies of God. And she said, "Sister Reid, don't say that. He will never be able to preach. He stutters.
Oh.
He's too shy.
Wow.
He will never make it. You are encouraging him.
You're
going to,
this.
and I'm hearing this. I'll never forget my mother. How's she going to respond to that? Because that's not what she's telling me." And I heard her look, and he said, "Charlotte, my son is going to be a preacher. And he will preach because God told him
Wow.
and me."
Wow.
And she never said anything more. That was the end of the conversation. But I never thought, I said the next morning, my mother, "Bob, I heard that last night."
Wow.
She said, "Don't you ever believe it." And she kind of hit me across the face and said, "And you better not believe it."
Tremendous. What was the moment where the stuttering stopped? You don't stutter now? I've never heard you stutter.
Well, I could.
Is it just below the surface? Is it in your system still somehow?
Somehow it is. And there are times when I'm tired that I will, and all of a sudden when I do that, I don't think most people have ever heard me stutter. Al Warner's on the other side. You never heard me stutter. But it will come back.
I had an assistant pastor that stuttered, and he said, "It's just below the surface. It's there."
I've never heard that described that way, but I'd say yes.
So there was no one moment of healing that you overcame it with God's confidence.
I really don't remember that. A lot of people ask me that. I don't remember the moment. It was just all of a sudden gone. But I knew it was going to be gone. It was like I knew it was going to be gone because I had to preach. I can't preach this.
Yeah.
So it has to be gone.
Or Robert said he was a stutterer. I've read several healing evangelists who said they were stutterers in the beginning. And then you were launched into pastoral ministry or evangelistic ministry?
No, evangelistic ministry. We, in the 1940s and early 50s.
What would that have looked like?
Well, two or three things. Number one, we would go to the smaller, Oral was going to the big cities. And we would go, we had a big tent. A very wealthy man bought us a brand new tent, which was a miracle in itself, how we got the tent. And some other people bought us the chairs, and somebody else bought us a truck. And we traveled in a big semi and with a tent and chairs.
Is that fairly common? Or other people, quite a few other people doing that?
There were several people in those days. Remember, most Assemblies of God and Pentecostal churches were about 100 people. 120 was a pretty large church.
Usually on the wrong side of the tracks?
Yeah. And so if you're going to have 1,000 people, you got to have a tent.
Yeah.
You can't afford an auditorium. Of course, tents were pretty expensive too.
Yeah.
But it was just the way to go.
Wow.
And we'd get 10 or 12 churches together.
When was the last time you've done tent meetings yourself? Can you remember anything in recent history where you've done anything like that, or just?
I'm trying to think. I did preach in a tent someplace, but having a tent meeting is probably, I'm 90 years old. It'd have to be 60 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. Different day.
It is a different day.
How'd you start being used by the Lord for healing? How did that come about?
I'm going to give you a strange answer. I think it began when I was a child, because I think you see things in the spirit before you see them in the flesh. I think that's when it began. So it was just natural. I walked from what I saw.
You saw wheelchairs being emptied out.
Mm-hmm.
You saw, and then you saw that actually materialize in the
Materialize,
natural. Wow. And you preached the gospel. Were you prophetic? Were you operating in other graces?
I don't think I knew what the prophetic was. I don't know that I was, because I didn't know, like we know today, somebody's prophetic. I don't know that I was that at all. Oral Roberts was kind of my idol. Maybe that's the wrong word.
He was an example for many
Well, example,
people,
I wanted to do it like he did. He had a tent seating 10,000. We had one seating, 1,500 to 2,000. And we would go to communities like cities of 25,000, 30,000, where there were 3 Assemblies of God churches and maybe a Church of God. They'd all get together, and we'd bring our tent there, and probably between the 3 congregations, they might have 500 people, and we'd have 2,000 in the tent, or 1,500.
So his mode was a short, impactful message, preaching the gospel, turn the chair around, people would walk in front, he'd pray for them.
And that's the way we did it, yeah.
Wow. I think a lot of people who saw him decided that that's the way they were going to do it.
Well, you always use a mentor, I think. It worked that way. I'd sit in the chair one night, I'd travel with my dad, and he would preach one night, I'd pray for the sick, and give the altar call, or maybe I'd give the altar call, and we'd divide the service before we went up, and sometimes we'd do things together.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you remember or recall, for those who are listening, some of the wonderful miracles that happened through your ministry?
I'm sitting here, I don't remember a specific miracle. I can go back to my archives. I've got notebooks, and I've got journals, of which tonight 2 cripples walked, but what is a cripple? Somebody that limps, somebody that can't walk, somebody's in a wheelchair.
Braces.
The braces. There's all kinds of people you could call a cripple.
Yeah.
And we used to put a scripture. We never claimed anything but the scripture that says that the lame walk and the blind see and the deaf hear. We would have that scripture, the scripture verse, on our advertising.
Wow. So how'd you move from that into being the pastor of one of the largest churches in New York? How'd that happen?
Well, that was a series of events. In 1959, my dad had this vision to go to the mission field. The Costin family, Alfred Costin, was the pastor of Bethel Temple. That's the large church built by Lester Sumrall out of the healing revivals, and in Manila, Philippines. And so we always wanted to go there, and a friend of ours became the pastor, invited us. We get to the Philippines. Now remember, my dad is a 50-year-old businessman that's never hardly preached a sermon. I've preached quite a few sermons by now, and I'm in around 20 years old, and we arrive in Manila. We get to Manila.
First overseas country?
The first overseas country. Wow. And this story is almost unbelievable. We arrive on a freighter. We go across 21 days on a freight ship, arrive in Manila. The Costins meet us at the port of Manila, put us in their car, take us to the house, and then Brother Costin says to my dad, Al, Elizabeth and I are going back to America. My dad said, I thought you invited us here for revival. We did, but our daughter's getting married, and you know my wife, she's not going to let her get married alone, so we've got to go back to America. I had no idea what was coming out of his mouth next. Now, you got to remember, I've never pastored a church. My dad has never pastored a church. He's a businessman. My dad wasn't a great preacher. He just cried and asked you to come to the altar. I found Jesus. and I was the preacher. And my dad just was the lover of people. And he looked at my dad and said, you and Tommy are going to be pastors of Bethel Temple.
No kidding.
Well, you've got to understand, Bethel Temple was running 7,000 people.
Yes.
It was the largest church denomination. It was built out of the healing of Clarita Villanueva.
The largest church in Asia at that time.
And, of course, it took our breath away. We'd never pastored a church. Every missionary in the Philippines is going to be mad at us. They all wanted the big church. Nobody's going to be happy. And, why do you do this? Brother Costin said, because God sent you here for this.
Wow.
And I remember he put his hand on my dad's shoulder. Al, this is God. Say yes.
Wow.
And so my dad said yes, and suddenly we said, we don't have any money. What are we going to live on? Oh, God will take care of that. Do you know, the next almost 2 years, I think it was a year and 8 months or something, we pastored that church, my dad and I, the largest church in the Assemblies of God, never pastored before, had no ability to do it, and it grew the fastest that it had ever grown. So Lester Summerall said, what did you do to make my church grow?
Wow.
I don't know. We just love people. My dad said, I don't know how to pastor a church, just love people. And as a result, of course, we became known all over the world, but it had nothing, I've got to tell you, nothing that I've ever done is a result of talent. Whatever story I tell you is a pure miracle of God. I had nothing to do with it whatsoever.
Wow. God's grace.
Including the fact that we pastored Bethel Temple. We weren't qualified to do that. How did it grow? I don't know. I have no idea.
Amazing.
Nobody can deny my story. It was too many years ago. Nobody's alive that saw it.
Yeah. Tell the people who are listening how that church started with Lester Summerall.
It started, let me tell you from Lester's, because Lester became my mentor. I said to him, Brother Summerall, what was it like? You left the pastor of the largest church in America, Assemblies of God Church in America's South Bend Assembly. You arrive in Manila. They tell you there's a church there, and it was kind of a lie. There were 7 families worshiping in a Mapayo market that was down by an open sewer.
Wow.
That stunk so bad you could hardly breathe. That's all there was. And you came all the way and left the largest church in America to pastor nothing. How did you feel? He said, I knew it was God. And then for a year, you had nothing. What did you do? He said, let me take you for a walk. He took me for a walk down the street near the Escolta, which is right in downtown Manila, overlooking the bay of which all the ships come in. And there were a bunch of ocean ships out there in the bay at anchor. I'll never forget this moment. He took me over. My dad he took me over and sat me in a bench, and I said, what was it like? He said, Tommy, I sat on this bench night after night after night, and I prayed one prayer. God, give me a place in this city. And with that, of course, after about a year, Clarita Villanueva was healed, the girl bitten by devils. And she had terrorized the city of Manila.
Front page news.
Front page news. She tore the bars, the prison bars. She tore them apart and broke out of prison. And she would go through the streets jumping and leaping and screaming at the top of her voice. And nobody could contain her.
She's a teenager or a young woman?
I don't know how old she was. She probably was maybe late teens, certainly early 20s. And instantly, she was, she and Bob Lester and Lester Summerall and Bob McAllister went into that prison. Everybody that went in there, they would make fun of. The bishop came; he couldn't deliver her. The exorcists came from all over the world. Medical doctors came. Nobody knew what to do with her. And Bob McAllister and Lester Summerall walked into that prison cell and cast that demon out. They said it took them about 6 hours, if I remember the story right. Brother Summerall said our shoes were full of water from the sweat.
Perspiration.
Of coming against that demon. By the end of that session, that girl was totally delivered, went on to become a mother of 3 children.
And this was all played out in the news?
In the news, in the front page newspaper.
6 o'clock news.
We got to remember, in those cultures, people really believe in demons.
Yes.
That kind of language is not our Western culture is not
Right.
like that. But in that culture, it's not abnormal to believe
They
that.
believe in witch doctors and the
Yeah.
spiritism, and so
And so
I read where Lester had been asking for property and all the red tape,
Yeah.
asking for a place to build a church, just got nowhere. But after that deliverance, the mayor gave him prime real estate.
Yeah, it was on Henry Luna, right by Taft Avenue. That's like Times Square. I mean, it was a huge place. It was a gift of God that was unbelievable.
Wow.
The man that arranged that, I'll never forget. When I used to have coffee with him every day. His name was Andy. I can't even think of it right now because I used to have coffee with him every morning. He didn't get it free, but he got it at a very low price.
But with no red
And
tape.
by the time the revival came, they were all they got a B-29 hangar and put that B-29 hangar, and they were building that building with no people.
Amazing.
He was stretching out to build that big
So
auditorium.
it's after World War II, so there's hangars available, and they got a government issue. And,
It was the
turned it into
greatest-
a nice looking building.
It was like standing in the middle of a miracle that was built by the
So
supernatural.
the building preached. The building preached.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it used to be called Bethel Temple, and then the big slogan was Christ is the answer. And all you'd have to do is get in any taxi cab in Manila, say, take me to Christ is the answer, and they'd take you to Christ is the answer.
Wow. Wow. Amazing revival. And from there, you came back to America? And
I came back to America, and that was only for a month or so. And then Lester called me again and asked me to go. He said, I built a new church in Hong Kong, and I need somebody to pastor that. And so we went back again and pastored there for a while.
Wow. And Lester had the largest Assembly of God church in America.
In America,
and he
yeah.
wanted to turn that over to you, but you said no, your hands were full with other
Well,
ministry?
he wanted me, first of all, they wanted us to stay in Manila, and that we knew was not right. We went back again to Asia, and then back again to America, and I knew I couldn't do anything else. I had to go to Buffalo.
So tell us about Buffalo and what was happening there that
Nothing was happening there.
Nothing was happening.
Nothing was happening there. If you want to hear the history, there were 3 Assemblies of God churches in Manila, in Buffalo. Each of them running, one was running maybe 100, and the second was running maybe 120, and the
Very
third one maybe
typical.
200. If there were 600-700 people, Jack Coe had come to town, and he put his big tent out. Now remember, there's less than 1,000 Pentecostals in Buffalo.
Wow, wow.
And Jack Coe put a tent up seating 12,000, and it would be filled to capacity night after night, and the miracles after miracles. And I would say a large percentage of those people were Polish women, because Buffalo is a largely Polish city.
It's an immigrant town, a
yeah,
factory
immigrant,
town.
yeah. And so that immigrant population filled that tent, and they were into miracles.
Wow.
And Jack Coe showed them that God could heal. Now, there wasn't a lot of fruit out of that in terms of actual people, but the city felt the power of God. And I knew I had to go back there. I knew that was my calling. But it was, let me see, probably 7 years, and I still had 120 people. And I
Wow.
thought, why did I leave? I left Cho.
The biggest church in Asia.
He wanted me to be his co-pastor. Brother Summerall wanted me to keep Bethel Temple. I turned them both down, and turned down 2 of the largest churches in the world to come and pastor 100 people.
Wow.
And I said, God, you must have made a mistake. This does not make sense. And I'm riding in my car one night, and I felt, did you ever pray, you've got words coming to your mouth and your head, but you've got words coming from here? And I guess I'm praying in the Spirit, because the words are coming from here, and I'm praying this prayer. And I'm sobbing as I'm praying it in my car. The words were, oh God, show me the world as you see it. And I would stop praying the prayer and said, no, I see the world as God sees it. I thought God pretty well hated the world. It was full of sin and debauchery and so on. And God is saying, you're not ready to see it. You're not open to see it. I said, Lord, if the world is different than I see it, show it to me. And all of a sudden, a light came in that car, brighter than I could possibly imagine. And I saw the world, and now probably it didn't take 2 seconds, but it was like I was living a lifetime in that short, because I was driving the car. I'm alone in the car. And I saw the world, and I saw Manila, where I used to pastor, and I saw Hong Kong, where I used to pastor for Lester, and I saw the cities where I was in America, and I saw the cities we'd gone to, Honolulu. We were actually elected the pastor of First Assembly in Honolulu when it was running 1,000 people, and I've turned down all of that to come to Buffalo, and nothing is happening. And I said, God, you made a mistake, or I've made a mistake. There's something wrong here. And all of a sudden I saw the world, and it was spinning around, and I hear myself saying, oh God, show me that as you see it. And I saw 2 nail-scarred hands take the world, and they opened it up, and inside the world was a broken heart. And God said to me, that's the way I see it.
Wow. Wow.
I mean, you don't see it with sin and debauchery? Well, of course that's there. But what I really see is people that are broken.
Wow.
It changed everything I believed about culture, about society. Why are people like they are? Because they're broken.
They're broken.
They're broken. It is. We think of the world as being wrong and sinful, and it is. But the reason it's that way is because the brokenness of people that do the sin gave me a complete, I've got to tell you, I was a totally different person. I recognized that I've got to approach the world differently.
You'd preach differently from that time on? I mean, you're preaching out of compassion, and that's an amazing revelation. He looks beyond our faults. He sees our need.
Sees our need.
Condition.
Yeah.
So. Wow. Did Lester Summerall ever come to Buffalo where you were pastoring?
Oh, yeah. He came often for me. That wasn't the best time in our relationship because he wanted me with him. It wasn't working in Buffalo. He knew it and I knew it.
Kind of I told you so?
Yeah. And then when it started growing, by that time I had a world to handle. We grew, remember, from 100 people to 800 people in one week.
Wow. Say that again.
We grew from 100 people to 800 people in 1 week.
In 1 week.
What happened was that the priest at the Basilica in Buffalo, the Our Lady of Victory Basilica, received the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And so I went down to hear him. All of a sudden, he's saying something that is strange to me. He's going to be baptized in water. I said, my God, if that priest is baptized in water, he's going to lose his parish. I know the church better than this. He won't continue to exist. And I remember Wanda was beside me, and I said, Wanda, if he does that, he won't have this church. Wanda looked at me and said, what are you going to do? I looked at her and said, invite him to live with us. Wanda said, okay. I said, are you all right with that? So I went up to him and I said, Jerry, if you lose your church, you come to live with me. And he did. It was
Pentecostals and Catholics.
Oh, we were, you remember, now he would get up every morning and go to Mass because he was still Catholic.
Still Catholic.
Had no intention of leaving the Catholic Church at all. And he was living with me. So he'd go to Mass every morning. He would travel our Assembly of God churches and preach and then go back to Mass. And I'm very mixed up. I thought when you became Pentecostal, you came out of that.
Well, your Assembly of God friends must have thought, what's wrong
They
with
thought
him?
I think probably they thought I was crazy. I didn't know whether I wasn't crazy or not. All I know is I had a Catholic priest living with me. Was very different. The interesting thing about the story is, though, within a matter of 6 months, I said, Jerry, because he came out of the church, and he became very anti-Catholic. And now I'm having to say, hey, listen, I can't have that kind of attitude in my church. We're not going to preach against the Catholic Church over here. I wasn't preaching against you when you came to live with me.
Yeah. We see that pendulum swing, though.
The pendulum swings. Yeah. You've got to keep loving that church.
Wow.
I went through that, and I think the Lord somehow, with both my wife and I, kept us to the point where we still love the Catholic Church. Still today I do.
Keep your heart in the love of God.
Yeah.
They would never have come to you, and God would never have given them to you if you didn't love them.
Yeah, yeah.
And so hundreds of Catholics started coming to your church.
Yeah, and it was, now, I don't know the percentage, but remember among those charismatics there were Baptists and Lutherans and Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Catholics and whatever. But they were all going to the Catholic Church to go to the renewal meeting. And they all started coming, and all of a sudden I have a congregation of hundreds. I had nothing, I can tell you, I had nothing to do with church growth.
It happened to you, not because of you.
Yeah.
But you were open to it. Other pastors maybe wouldn't have been as receptive.
Well, I don't think
open.
they were. I don't blame them for that, because I wouldn't have been either a year before
God
that.
hadn't given you his heart.
No, if God hadn't given me his heart, if I hadn't had that vision, that wouldn't have happened to me either.
What an amazing story. Amazing story.
Well, one more part of the story is that between then and the invasion of all these people, I went to Toronto. I had a friend in Toronto by the name of Alec Ness, who built the Queensway Cathedral. And then at that point, I don't think it was on Queensway any longer. He'd built another church. He built a couple of churches. I think by then he had built the Christian Center. And he had put me up in a high-rise overlooking Manila to preach a week of meetings for him.
Manila or Toronto?
Toronto, I'm sorry. In Toronto, I'm sorry. So I was in Toronto in this high-rise looking over the city, and I was weeping. I saw God touch a city, and I wanted God to touch Buffalo, and I just prayed, oh, God, give me Buffalo. And at that point, God said, I want you to go back to Buffalo a different person. I want you to see the church as I see it and do it my way.
Wow.
You've done it your way too long.
You've done it your way too long.
Yeah. And what has it gotten you?
So Buffalo, the church in Orchard Park, called the Tabernacle, would have become what's called a mega church today, and probably the largest church in New York, outside of New York City.
Well, at one time, I don't know that it is now,
time.
But it's, I've been gone a long time. And we were in the midst of revival. We didn't have anything to do with that church growth. It was God that sent those people to us.
So if you were invited to be a church growth expert at a conference,
I would tell them I don't know anything about that church growth.
What would you say?
I don't know.
God did it.
I don't know anything.
Wow.
God sent those people to us, and I literally do not know anything about church growth.
Wow.
It was simply stand at the door. And at that point, we had a little building that seated 197 people. But we had built it, I think, by the will of God, with rooms all around it, with folding partitions, so we could actually pull all those folding partitions back and seat about almost 400 people.
So you're having multiple services.
Yeah, we had to have 2 Sunday services, and we had 2 Sunday morning services and 2 Sunday night services.
Wow.
2 Sunday night services were the biggest because the charismatics came from all over, and they both would run 400 people each.
So people knew that if you wanted to find life or find renewal, you'd go to the tabernacle. You'd find life there. You'd find.
That's really the way it was. It was not somebody trying to grow a church. It wasn't church growth. It was a center for renewal.
Center for renewal.
And people came for that. Did many of them stay? Sure, that's how we built a great church. Many of them did stay. But that was a 2 or 3 year process.
Wow. I used to see on the back of Charisma magazine, a large conference somewhere, all these little photographs, and your photograph was always on there seemed like for years it ran. But and with Yonggi Cho, and somehow, how did that connection ever happen with you and
because
Yonggi Cho?
The Assemblies of God in Springfield, Missouri, because we had made Bethel Temple grow, called us and said to my dad and I, and said, we've got a young man in Korea by the name of Cho, and will you go to Korea? You've done well working with Reuben Candelaria, the pastor there, and he's loved you, and so maybe you could help us with this young man. We see great potential in him. And we got to Korea. Let's see, that would have been about 1960 or 61. We got to Korea, and they built Cho a building. It seated 1,500, and he had about 200 people. And we did the first healing crusade for him. That's what we did. We did healing crusades. And that's what he was looking for. But he said to me, I remember, I'll never forget it. Cho looked at me, and we're in a panel truck. He's in a seat in the back of the truck, and I'm in the front seat. And I looked back at him, and he said, Tommy, I get tired of these healing evangelists that come through here, and they fake miracles. Can you give me some real miracles? And I was kind of young and impetuous, and I said, well, why not? After all, that's what God does, isn't it? Well, he ought to be doing it. And we saw phenomenal miracles.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, that church was overflowing with people. By the first night, the seats were filled, and it was filled every night, people? Night after night after night. And Cho saw some miracles. They were genuine miracles.
Wow, praise God.
I've got pictures of some of the cripples that walked, and I've got albums with them in, and stories from my journal of what happened. But Cho would have told you, if he was still alive, he'd tell you that we saw miracles together. But we were two young men. He became like my little brother, or my big brother, or whatever. And we had it happen together. The only thing I had to say no to him, he wanted me to be co-pastor, and I said, this is a Korean church. It's not an American church. You don't want an American pastor.
Has to be indigenous. Mm-hmm. And that went on to become the largest church
in the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you would do conferences together in church growth? Or?
Oh, we did conferences all over the world together, yeah. We were very close friends.
Wow.
He was like part of our family. I look at pictures together in the albums, and it hurts when your parents die. Losing my parents was hard. Losing Cho was difficult. He was my buddy.
Yeah, wow.
He's a friend.
So at 90 years old, you've lived on this whole crossroads of amazing period of church history.
I look, sometimes I don't often tell my story. You got me to tell. I don't know that I've ever told it live in an interview like this, because it is too unbelievable. If I didn't have a church in Korea that's the largest church in the world, and if Manila wasn't as large as it is, my story wouldn't be believable. Yeah. But there's still some residual of it that's still there.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And that happened to you, not because of you.
Yeah.
God used you.
No, remember, I had nothing to do with the growth of Manila, of either church.
Right.
They both grew under somebody else's ministry.
Wow. So good to hear. So good to hear your heart. And I've seen your love for pastors, your love for church, the local church, love for missions, thank you for all the years that you've just allowed the Lord to move through you and use you to refresh the body.
I'm in an interesting part of my life at 90 years of age. You've been around me. It's a little cold out right now in our weather right now, but I'm a pretty active person. I still drive a convertible with the top down. No, it's not a Cadillac. The last convertible they made in America, a large car, was a Chrysler, and that's what I have. I've got about a 12-year-old Chrysler with a hard top, but I'm still, in most of my ways, I'm a pretty young man.
Your mind is sharp.
I don't. And I still travel. I'm here. I'm away from home.
You're here doing this conference together.
Don't know that I'll take any more overseas trips, and I really thought about it. Joe wanted me to come, and I probably, if he'd lived, I would have gone. But right now, I'm here, still alive. And traveling and
we're grateful
preaching.
for that, and still loving the local church and being used by God to encourage the brothers. It's wonderful.
I have a tremendous love for the local church. I think the local church is the center of God's world.
I'm with you on that. I think it's the center of everything. God bless you.
And then when you talk about local churches, you can't go away from realize how significant they are. But I got can I say one more thing? I got introduced to the local church in an unusual way. I'm thankful to God for giving me Lester Sumrall. He became my friend.
What a great man.
A builder of local churches.
Great man.
Marie Brown and her nephew, Stan Berg, pastored Glad Tidings in New York City, right on 33rd Street. And when I was growing up, I thought, I would love to stand in that pulpit. And one day I stood there. Every year I preach the Missions Convention, which is their biggest week. I don't know how God granted that to me, but I got to see what Marie and Brother Brown did all those years ago. Do you know what it would take to build a church of a couple thousand people in New York City? Little Marie Brown did that. Old Brother Brown would sit at his desk, and this was before I came, because he was gone by the time I preached there. And he would look up from his desk and say, "There will be 14 souls come to Christ tonight."
He'd know.
You count it. There would be 14 people come to Christ.
Wow.
And to stand in that pulpit was to see the wonder of a local church and what it did in New York City. That church was mostly made up of maids and house workers, because that's who that population was.
Right.
Those people that lived on Manhattan. It was a place of glory. It was a place of wonder.
Place of glory. Wow.
Yeah. And, so was Lester Sumrall's. The great churches in America, some of them are no more. Glad Tidings still exists, and I guess in a couple locations. But to see the wonder of what local churches do is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It's the center of everything. Yeah, thank you.